Okay, so I'm going to give about a 40-minute talk. And if you've been reading anything I've been writing for the last year and a half or so, you might find that I'm repeating myself, and I hope that's okay. But I'm mostly excited to just have a conversation afterwards with you all and see where you all see all this stuff going. So here goes. There's a stubborn story about the last 2 years that explains right-wing populism as a grassroots backlash against something called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is often described as market fundamentalism, or the belief that everything on the planet has a price tag. Borders are obsolete, the world economy should replace nation states, and human life is reducible to a cycle of earn, spend, borrow, die. Populists, by contrast, we are told, claim to believe in the people, national sovereignty, and the importance of culture. As mainstream parties lose support, the elites who promoted neoliberalism out of self-interest or misguided strategy are reaping the fruits of the inequality and democratic disempowerment that they themselves sowed. Globalization's chickens have come home to roost, and Davos man stands shame before the masses. Pitchforks circle the penthouses. This story is wrong, I think, for at least 2 reasons. First, most right-wing populist parties from the United States to Great Britain to Austria are not avenging angels sent to smite economic globalization. Their support comes often from voters of above-average income, and they offer no plans to rein in finance, restore a golden age of job security, or end world trade. Brexitism, for example, is not a program to go it alone, but rather a goal to pivot from a continental to a global market, or maybe even to an Anglo-American market if we're following the kind of proposed free trade arrangements for post-Brexit Britain. By and large, in other words, the so-called populist calls to privatize, deregulate, and slash taxes could come straight from the playbook shared by the world's leaders for the last 30 years. Second, to understand neoliberalism as an apocalyptic hyper-marketization of everything is, I think, both vague and misleading. Bringing neoliberalism down to earth means understanding it not just as a political swear word, but also as an intellectual movement dating back 7 decades to when the term was coined. And I apologize here if this history is already familiar to people. But for those who haven't sort of heard the potted history of where neoliberalism as a self-description comes from, gathering in Paris in 1938, picking through the wreckage of the world economy after the Great Depression, a group of scholars, business people, and journalists appended the neo to liberalism to signal their own realization that the market would not take care of itself. In an era of dissolving empires and rising mass democracy, the role of the state, in other words, needed to be defined anew. Many of those same people reunited in 1947 above Lake Geneva to form the Mont Pelerin Society, named after the mountain where they met. They were hosted by perhaps the most famous neoliberal, the economist Friedrich Hayek, whose 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom, sounded the alarm against fascism, communism, and most importantly, social democracy, at the very moment that the National Health Service and other features of the welfare state were being created. Hayek described the intention of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1952 to, quote, allow personal contact among the proponents of neoliberalism. So just using that quote to show that he was using the term himself. And the goal was to see how the practical application of neoliberalism could be applied to the problems of different countries, end quote. So, far from conjuring up a vision of capitalism without states, neoliberals, as Hayek described in 1984, had the intention of discussing the problems of constitutional constraints on government. They reflect a discussion over almost a century about how the state needs to be rethought to restrict democracy without eliminating it, and how national and supranational institutions can be used to protect competition and exchange. The famous rollback of the state, promised by the epitome of neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher, has always implied the rollout of a new one. And I'm not the first person to point that out. When we see neoliberalism as a project of retooling the state to save capitalism, then its supposed opposition to populism begins to dissolve. Both neoliberals and populists scorn egalitarianism, global economic equality, and solidarity beyond the nation. Both see capitalism as inevitable and judge citizens by the standards of productivity and efficiency. Perhaps most strikingly, as I'll talk about, both draw from the pantheon of the same heroes. Case in point here is Friedrich Hayek himself, who was an icon on both sides of the neoliberal populist divide. Speaking alongside Marine Le Pen at the party congress of the French National Front, now French National Assembly, last year, self-described populist Steve Bannon condemned the, quote, establishment and the, quote, globalists, but he built his speech around Hayek's own metaphor of the road to serfdom, and he invoked the authority of the master's name in his talk. In Zurich the week before, Bannon also summoned Hayek in his talk. There he was hosted by the newspaper publisher, right-wing Swiss People's Party politician, and member of the Friedrich Hayek Society, Roger Kuppel, who presented Bannon with the first issue of their newspaper, Wirtschaftswoche, while whispering under his breath that it was, quote, from 1933, a time when that very newspaper was briefly supportive of the Nazi seizure of power. It's kind of a strange, like, literally caught on the lapel mic moment, actually, when you watch it on film. Let them call you racist, Bannon said in his stump speech. Let them call you xenophobes. Let them call you nativists. Wear it as a badge of honor. The goal of the populists, he said, was, quote, not to maximize shareholder value, as he'd been taught at Harvard Business School, but to, quote, maximize citizenship value. This sounded less like a rejection of neoliberalism than a deepening of the economic logic into the heart of collective identity. Populists, in other words, in this case, were less discarding the neoliberal idea of human capital and combining it with national identity. We could call it a discourse of folk capital. While in Europe, Bannon met with Alice Weidel, former Goldman Sachs consultant and one of the two heads of the AfD, and also a member of the Friedrich Hayek Society. Another AfD member, a former libertarian blogger and precious metals consultant, Peter Boehringer, about whom I can say a lot more in the Q&A, he's quite the wild character, is also a Hayek Society member, and he's currently the Bundestag delegate from Amberg in Bavaria in the Bundestag, and the chair of the Parliamentary Budget Committee, a full-on kind of apocalyptic gold bug, predictor of the coming collapse of the system for which one must train oneself athletically, make stores of food and fresh water, and kind of be sure to hold value in gold rather than fiat currency, which is itself the, quote, tinder that will set the world on fire, in his phrasing. In September 2017, Steve Bannon's former outlet, Breitbart, had run an interview with Beatrix von Storch, the AfD's deputy party leader and another Hayek Society member. She explained how Hayek had inspired her commitment to, quote, rehabilitate the family. So much for radical individualism. In Austria, the right-wing populist Austrian Freedom Party includes as its negotiator Barbara Kolm, who is both the director of Vienna's Hayek Institute and a board member on Honduras's drive to create special deregulated zones outside of formal state control, also a member of the Mont Pelerin Society and a frequent speaker there. People have probably seen this. It's been in the news, in both English and the German-speaking news, how she has now been charged with funneling money through the Austrian Economic Center and the Hayek Institute to the European Conservatives and Reformers, the right-wing party in the European Parliament. She's already sort of falling under disrepute among some of the neoliberals themselves. I got an email from Bruce Caldwell, who's the literary executor of Hayek's estate, who said that he and Peter Betke, who is the former president of the Mont Pelerin Society, are starting to feel like there might be a split in the Mont Pelerin Society because of the affiliations of German Austrians with the right-wing political parties in the European landscape. So this stuff is really actually happening right now. The email was about 2 weeks ago. Meanwhile, all the while, among Bannon's despised globalists, quote unquote, former congressional majority leader Paul Ryan announced last year that he would not run for re-election. But the man who Bannon once described memorably as, quote, born in a petri dish at the Heritage Foundation, which itself was, by the way, founded by a former Mont Pelerin Society member, Edwin Follner, was also a Hayek superfan, handing out copies of The Road to Serfdom to his staff in his 2012 vice presidential run. GQ imagined his inner monologue upon retirement. Quote, at last I will be free to while away my waking hours, moderating the F.A. Hayek subreddit in peace. Just what is going on here? When the populists and the globalists on the right share the same hero, we need to understand better how the neoliberal family tree has sprouted such apparently different branches. History shows us, I think, that the two isms, populism and neoliberalism, only appear contradictory in their current guises. What we are witnessing is not so much a clash of opposites, as we're often made to think, especially if you read the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, as the public surfacing of a long simmering dispute in the neoliberal camp about what is necessary to keep the free market alive. The stakes of the feud, I would argue, couldn't be higher. Is a common culture and even a common race required for healthy capitalism? Should nation states restrict immigration from non-Western countries? Do international institutions like the EU, the World Trade Organization, and the IMF help or hinder the freedom of the market? As the irony of history would have it, as I'll describe in the remainder of the talk, the conflict that split the so-called globalists from the so-called populists erupted first in the 1990s, at the very moment when so many claimed that neoliberal ideas had finally conquered the world. Part 2, and I'm gonna get some water. Neoliberalism is often understood as a set of solutions, a bullet point plan to destroy solidarity in the welfare state. Naomi Klein describes it as a shock doctrine, swooping in at times of disaster, gutting and selling off public services and transferring control from states to corporations. The Washington Consensus, described by the economist John Williamson in 1989, is probably the most famous example of neoliberal solutionism. A list of 10 must-dos for developing countries, from tax reform to trade liberalization to privatization. Critics have traced, of course, the rollout of these so-called reforms across the global south and Eastern Europe, often to the devastating results. From this perspective, neoliberalism can look like a recipe book, a panacea, and a kind of a one-size-fits-all nostrum. But I would argue that the writing of neoliberals themselves offers a different picture. And here's where we have to go to make sense of the apparently contradictory political manifestations that I began the talk by describing. Here we discover, reading the writings of actual neoliberals, that neoliberal thought is not filled with solutions, but with problems. Can judges, dictators, bankers, or business people be reliable guardians of the economic order? Can institutions be made, or must they grow? How can markets be accepted by people in the face of their frequent cruelty? The problem that has stalked the neoliberals most through the last 70 years is the balance between capitalism and democracy. It's amazing, actually, The Economist, right, that was published last week, is capitalism incompatible with democracy? Stephen Moore, briefly going to be a nominee for the Federal Reserve Board, has this clip that went around saying, I don't really believe in democracy very much, actually. Capitalism is more important than democracy. I mean, these things which would have seemed like kind of third rails in political discourse are becoming quite normalized. In the case of the neoliberals in the 20th century, and this is kind of what I cover in my book, universal suffrage, which really started to go global after the First World War, meant successive waves of clamoring, demanding masses, always threatening to push the functioning market order off of its tracks, as populations used their votes to blackmail politicians into ever more favors, and thus draining the state budget and driving it into the red. Many neoliberals feared that democracy had an inherent bias towards socialism. They disagreed over the decades, though, about which institutions would safeguard capitalism from these threats of democracy. Some defended a return to the gold standard, while others argued that currency should be free to float. And the gold standard, by the way, was considered a long-settled argument until relatively recently. It's quite shocking if you follow the stuff that there are people now who might be on the Federal Reserve, the Fed's board, who actually believe in the return to a gold standard. I mean, it's actually insane. Some thought that ideas should circulate freely. There's actually some real anti-IP or IP dove kind of folks among the neoliberals, including Fritz Machlup. Others felt that there was a case that had to be made for super strong IP rights. Some thought religion was a necessary condition for a liberal society. Others saw it as dispensable. Most saw the traditional family as the basic economic and social unit, and you'll find that if you read Melinda Cooper's recent excellent book, Family Values. But others disagreed. Some saw neoliberalism as designing the right constitution, literally the right legal document. Others saw a constitution in that sense, in a democracy, as, in a memorably gendered metaphor from one libertarian, quote, a chastity belt whose key is always within the wearer's reach. Compared to other political and intellectual movements, though, it was actually the absence of serious sectarian splits within neoliberalism that was most remarkable, if you think about it. From the 1940s to the 1980s, the center more or less held. There wasn't kind of like splitterism within the neoliberal movement of any significant form. The sole major internal conflict about which I write in my book came in the early 60s, though, with the estrangement of one of the movement's leading thinkers and so-called intellectual father of the social market economy, Wilhelm Röpke, who left the Mont-Pelerin Society with the sort of secretary of the Mont-Pelerin Society, Albert Hunold. And I mention that only because when I got this email from Bruce Caldwell, he said, we might be looking at another Hunold moment. In other words, this moment where there has to be a division. In the case of Röpke, his split with other neoliberals was in part about his adherence to ideas of scientific racism and his open advocacy for apartheid South Africa. At the time, this was kind of a fringe position within the Mont-Pelerin Society, and it did kind of make him a pariah. While the open embrace of whiteness was an outlier position, I would say, in the 1960s as a kind of active analytical category, it would later, as we'll see, return to divide the neoliberals in the decades that came. While some might see it as a contradiction to combine xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment with neoliberalism, which is the supposed philosophy of open borders, this was not the case in an early site of neoliberal breakthrough, Thatcher's Britain. Thatcher was, of course, well known for her opposition to immigration, especially from the non-white countries of the Commonwealth. In fact, it was here that we first see the emergence of a Hayek that Steve Bannon could love. In 1978, and this is the kind of thing that doesn't really get that gets sort of short shrift in the hagiographic scholarship that mostly exists around Hayek. Hayek, who had taken British citizenship as an emigre from fascist Austria, wrote a series of editorials in the Times of London supporting Thatcher's call for, quote, an end to immigration. To make his case, Hayek harked back to his native Vienna, where he was born in 1899, recalling the difficulties created when, quote, large numbers of Galician and Polish Jews arrived from the East before the First World War and failed to integrate easily, thus, in Hayek's terms, provoking outbursts of racialized resentment. The title of the op-ed was The Origins of Racialism, and the origins were not racist, but the Jews were actually the ones who created the racism. It was sad but true, Hayek wrote, that, quote, however far modern man accepts in principle the idea that the same rules should apply to all men, in fact, he does concede it only to those whom he regards as similar to himself, and only slowly learns to extend the range of those he does accept as his likes. While far from absolute, and there was a lot of back and forth, the reason he wrote 4 of these is because he kept on getting angry letters to the editor, and people were surprised that this liberal, especially someone who had, let's say a Jewish mentor and was not considered generally someone who would spout xenophobic and anti-immigration tropes, was nonetheless putting this all in print. While far from absolute, Hayek's suggestion by the 70s was that a shared culture or a shared group identity was actually necessary for a functioning market order. This was a turn for him from what had been a blueprint until then for a neoliberal society much more founded in a universalist notion of humans everywhere under the rule of law, something that could just sort of be indeed sort of copy and pasted and globalized. Some of his new restrictionist attitude, of course, resonated with British neoliberals who always tended more Tory in comparison to the libertarian tendencies of the Americans. Recall that no less an opponent of non-white immigration than Mr. Rivers of Blood, Enoch Powell, was a member of the Mont-Pelerin Society and spoke at several of its meetings. Yet Hayek was nothing if not an eclectic thinker. Well, on the one hand, he sounded like just another Thatcherite conservative at times. The man who delivered a speech titled Why I Am Not a Conservative was actually drawing on different inspirations. One of the novelties of the 1970s, in fact, was that Hayek's theories of conservative values were being combined with influences from a new philosophy, that of sociobiology, itself commingled with his previous interest in cybernetics, ethology, or the study of animal behavior, and system theory. Sociobiology was named in 1975 as the title of a book by the Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson. It held that individual human behavior could be understood by the same evolutionary logics as animals and other organisms. We all seek to maximize the reproduction of our own genetic material. The fate of traits in humans could be understood the same way. Selection pressures weed out the less useful traits, while the more useful ones multiply. And you're probably already thinking of many things that this sounds like, right? Kind of Richard Dawkins. I mean, Konrad Lorenz is one of the big fathers of animal behavior study. And there's a clear way that this kind of rebooted social Darwinism is kind of back in the mix. And that really starts at this time period in the mid-1970s. Hayek, though interestingly, was taken by the insights of sociobiology, but questioned the overemphasis on genes. He proposed that human change could best be understood through processes of what he called, quote, cultural evolution. This is a term that would resonate through neoliberal arguments for the next 4 decades. So it's kind of like, you know, if you want to show that you're like in the know in Austrian economics, you write a paper about cultural evolution and all the people are like, right, you're on it, the real Hayek stuff. Nothing about prices, nothing about capital, cultural evolution. While US conservatives had promoted a so-called fusionism of market libertarianism with cultural conservatism in the 1950s around William F. Buckley, and the National Review. So this is the sort of typical way of understanding the history of the US right. It's basically the Christians got together with the capitalists and created this thing called fusionism. Hayek's opening to science would ultimately create a new fusionism that would offer a conceptual space for kind of scattershot borrowings from evolutionary psychology, cultural anthropology, and even a kind of revived racial science. And this now has become a kind of argot, especially of the kind of chat room world of the internet, right? And this actually is global, as I just found out, talking to a woman who's from Hong Kong who researches kind of far-right Weibo discussions and things like that. And she's like, yeah, it's always this strange admixture of evolutionary psych, libertarianism, some weird Hayek and Mises reference thrown in there, like Jordan Peterson, like icing over everything. And you never really know what to make of this as like an ideology. And I was like, I know. I'm trying to write the history of that fucking thing. It's not fun. But this is, it does have a history, and it starts in the mid-70s. And by the early 80s, Hayek had begun to speak of tradition in a way that he'd never had before, and kind of reverentially, and as a necessary ingredient for the good society of functioning market order. In front of the Heritage Foundation, no less, alleged birthplace of Paul Ryan, he spoke in 1982 of, quote, our moral heritage as the foundation of healthy market societies. In 1984, he wrote that, quote, we must return to a world in which not only reason, but reason and morals as equal partners must govern our lives, where the truth of morals is simply one moral tradition, that of the Christian West, which has created morals in modern civilization. So it's actually kind of rediscovering the centrality of morality. And Hayek that, for example, has led the political philosopher Wendy Brown, who some of you might know, to write literally a new book, revising her last book, which was basically saying neoliberalism is markets, undoing the demos. Her new book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, is like, actually it's markets plus morality, and the way we can think about that is also through the kind of work of Hayek. The implication of Hayek by the 80s was clear. Some societies had developed the cultural traits of personal responsibility, ingenuity, rational action, and low time preference over long periods with the ability to delay gratification, hugely important in this discussion. Others had not. Because these traits were not easily imported or transplanted, those less culturally evolved societies, i.e. the developing world, the non-white world, would need to experience a very long period of diffusion and trial and error before ever catching up to the West. An endpoint which Hayek and people who followed him, including William Easterly, one of the most well-known critics of development economics, who is a just dyed-in-the-wool Hayekian of this variety, were not guaranteeing would ever arrive. So it wasn't even like, just wait, be patient. It was kind of like an infinite deferral. Like maybe there will never be prosperity in some parts of the world. We don't know if cultural traits travel like that. So by the 80s, a new culturalist strain of neoliberalism was being worked out. Not only in the work of Hayek himself, here and there, but in the work of these self-described Austrian economists at George Mason University in particular, at the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, which was founded in 1982, and also in Germany in the work of German thinkers like Gerard Radnitsky and Erich Weder. So both one philosopher of science, the other a sociologist. Culture matters was the new mantra, right? So far from the kind of homo economicus is all we need to know. No, culture matters. We need to think about culture almost first. The politics, though, that would follow from this new mantra were not yet clear. Part 4, another drink of water. In 1989, the spirit of history intervened and the Berlin Wall fell, right around here. In the wake of this unpredicted and unpredictable event, the question of whether cultures of capitalism could be transplanted or had to grow organically suddenly exploded into contemporary relevance. Transitionology, horrible word, became a new field as social scientists set themselves the problem of making ex-communist countries capitalist. Hayek was granted a Presidential Medal of Freedom by George H.W. Bush in 1991 as a visionary whose ideas were, quote, validated before the eyes of the world. By the way, Arthur Laffer, founder of supply-side economics, was just granted a Presidential Medal of Freedom by Donald J. Trump a couple of weeks ago. For those of you who are still following the kind of RIP neoliberalism train, like this is probably the one that should force you to get off it. You might assume that neoliberals would spend the rest of the 90s basking in self-congratulation, polishing the busts of Mises and Hayek, which were indeed eventually planted in universities, public squares, and libraries across Eastern Europe. But the exact opposite was true. Recall that the prime enemy of the neoliberals since the 30s had not been the Soviet Union, or Red China, but the social democracy of the West. The fall of communism meant that the real enemy now has new fields of potential expansion. As Mulpellerin Society President James M. Buchanan put it in 1990, quote, socialism is dead, but Leviathan lives on. For neoliberals then, the 90s brought three main concerns. The first was the post-Soviet question. Could the newly liberated communist bloc be expected to convert to responsible market actors overnight, and what would be necessary for them to do so? Second was about Europe. Was the ever-tightening European integration of that decade, which turned the European community into the European Union and signed on to the idea of a single currency, the harbinger of a neoliberal continent, or simply the scaling up of a superstate of welfare policy, labor rights, and redistribution? Perhaps the EU was not the guardian of capitalist competition that some neoliberals had hoped for it to be. Perhaps it was actually a Trojan horse, replicating the problems of bureaucracy and redistribution at a grander level. If EC Commissioner Jacques Delors invoked social Europe in the early 1990s, this phrase kind of haunted neoliberal nightmares. The third question was about immigration. Neoliberal Nightmare sounds like a new Wendy Brown book. Maybe I should give her that title. Oh no, there is a new book called Never Ending Nightmare about neoliberalism, Dardot and Laval. I don't know where this arms race of neoliberalism book titles can go from here, really. It's just like, it must reach an end at some point. The third question, of course, was about immigration. Changing demographics, meaning an aging white population matched by a growing non-white population in the global north, along with increased south-north migration in the 90s, prompted some right-wing neoliberals to continue Hayek's line of thinking by revisiting the conditions necessary for capitalism. Perhaps some cultures and even some races might be predisposed to market success, while others were not. The 90s then inaugurated a rift in the neoliberal camp between those who believed in supranational institutions like the EU, the WTO, and international investment law. We could call them globalists. That's kind of the story I told in the book that I just published. And on the other hand, those who felt that the neoliberal outcomes that they wanted were best served by sovereignty returning to the nation, or maybe even to smaller units of secession. They promoted exit, whether from the European Union or even to new countries. Think here of the seasteaders and charter cities and free private cities, the sort of fantasy of the zone that was so rife in the 1990s and 2000s. This group included libertarians alongside the mobilizing group, as we'll see, of neoliberal populists. The ever-growing influence of Hayek's ideas of cultural evolution and the growing mainstream popularity of neuroscience and evolutionary psychology also led many in the secessionist camp to turn to the harder sciences, right? It's not a coincidence that the genome is final, human genome is finally mapped, and this is a moment when someone like Charles Murray, Mulpellerin Society member, latches onto that to say, aha, the source for inequality is not in culture even, it's in, right, the human genome, and it's actually written in DNA. The kind of trump card against any claims for egalitarian redistribution. Some, like German Mulpellerin Society member and Friedrich Naumann Stiftung employee, good to talk shit about another Stiftung while you're in another Stiftung space. Dietmar Döring even sought to rehabilitate openly in the incredible libertarian magazine Eigentümlich Frei the category of social Darwinism. The article is called something like Social Darwinism, like were we too quick or something, like it's like just about bringing it back. The crises that followed 2008, including the Eurozone crisis, of course, brought the tensions between these two camps of neoliberals to a boil. The arrival of over 1 million refugees in the course of 2015 created the opportunity for a new winning political hybrid that combines xenophobia with free market values. One such site was the British Leave campaign, which combined a call to ditch Europe for a global orientation with open agitation against migrants. The Brexit campaign itself was built on foundations laid by Margaret Thatcher herself, an early figurehead for neoliberal Euroscepticism. In a famous speech in 1988 in Bruges, Thatcher declared that, quote, "We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels," end quote. Inspired immediately by this Bruges speech and the woman who had knighted him, former Mont Pelerin Society President Lord Ralph Harris of the Institute of Economic Affairs, the kind of Ur think tank in London, formed what he called the Brugge Group in 1990 to protest now the encroachments of Delors' social Europe. He invited an octogenarian Hayek to join him, but Hayek declined, he was no longer traveling and so on. Through the 90s, it was neoliberals organized in the Brugge Group, the European Constitutional Group, which was out of here in Berlin, and the Center for the New Europe, which was out of Brussels, uncomfortably close to the title of the place we did, but very much a different place. All of these places were stocked almost exclusively with members of the Mont Pelerin Society, and they were most consistently picking up on the call originally raised by Buchanan that there had to be a right of secession written into the Maastricht Treaty. After the 2016 vote to leave, the head of public policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs published a post concluding that, quote, "Hayek would have been a Brexiteer." Today, the website of the Brugge Group proudly proclaims across the top, quote, to have spearheaded the intellectual battle to win a vote to leave the European Union. And Nigel Farage himself was involved with the group and publishing things with them in the early 2000s. The so-called populists in this case come literally directly from the neoliberal ranks, right? Not even using a broad definition of neoliberal like Mont Pelerin Society members. While the Brexiteers praise the nation, the appeal to nature is more conspicuously on display in Germany and Austria. Perhaps most striking about the new fusionism is the way it blends neoliberal beliefs about markets with dubious claims about social psychology. The fixation on intelligence testing and IQs is especially noticeable, and just you cannot miss it if you dabble anywhere in this world. While one probably usually associates the term, quote, cognitive capital with French and Italian Marxists out of the autonomous tradition, neoliberals like Charles Murray have actually used that term cognitive capital as far back as 1994 in the Bell Curve to describe what he believed to be the partially heritable group differences in intelligence that he quantifies as IQ. The German sociologist Erich Wede, co-founder of the Friedrich Hayek Society here in Germany, granted the Hayek Medal by them in 2012, follows like the last great quote-unquote race theorist Richard Lynn to understand intelligence as the primary determinant of economic growth. So Lynn wrote something with a actually fairly respectable Finnish political scientist called IQ and the Wealth of Nations, which is just kind of a map of the globe that shows supposedly average IQs for each country, maps it onto GDP and says, voila, what more do you need? In their version, the wealth and poverty of nations is not explained, of course, by history, but by the intractable qualities of its populations. According to former Bundesbank board member Thilo Sarrazin, right, who shares the same opinion, whose Germany, Deutschland schafft sich ab, never quite sure how to pronounce or translate that, abolishes itself, has sold, as people in this room would know, over 1.5 million copies in Germany, and spurred, of course, the success of Islamic-phobic parties like the AfD, who themselves have a section in their party program titled, "Don't do us in, Deutschland nicht abschaffen," calling for, of course, a Willkommenskultur für Kinder, we'll make our own Germans. We've all seen the posters. Sarrazin also cites Richard Lynn. Richard Lynn, an incredible dude who actually was approached by Ralph Harris, the co-founder of the Institute of Economic Affairs in 1970, to start what was going to be called a Francis Galton Institute for Human Motivation. The idea being that you could apply psychology and intelligence testing to the problems of free market behavior and especially education to kind of insert a psychological aspect into the think tank world, which didn't ever come off the ground, but amazingly was being funded by Nigel Lawson, who people might know as a later big funder for right-wing climate denial research, quote unquote. I'm having to use air quotes a lot. This folk capital, Sarrazin cites Lynn in Deutschlandschaft and other intelligence researchers to argue, of course, against immigration from Muslim-majority countries on the basis in part of heritable IQ. This folk capital notion, shared by right-wing neoliberals, assigns intelligence averages to countries in a way that collectivizes and renders innate the concept of human capital, itself a pretty benign and mainstream category. They add overtones of values and traditions that cannot be captured statistically, shading into a language of national essence and national character. In November 2017, Sarrazin shared the stage with Erich Wede at the Hayek Society's Freedom Forum here in Berlin. He spoke at the one the next year too. Both speakers argued in favor of tight borders to preserve strong property rights and bemoan the burden placed on state budgets by immigrants who, quote, bring little or no human capital with them, as Wede put it. Wede and Sarrazin made another telling and seemingly paradoxical argument that closed borders were actually necessary to save globalization. So this is not a turn away from globalization, this is a way to save globalization. Knowledge, goods, and ideas, quote, should be free to migrate, Sarrazin said. People, however, did not have to move in large numbers. That had already, quote, brought nothing but deterioration. While the extension of production chains and cross-border trade had led to the economic uplift, according to this narrative, of distant foreign populations as a group, immigration only helped the small number who made the risky voyage. And this echoes of the sort of the brain drain argument here, right? As Wede put it, quote, even under pure humanitarian Rawlsian criteria, it would be bad if mass migration threatened global free trade. People, in other words, must remain fixed so that capital and goods could remain free. These neoliberals, come populists, argued that the world's poor needed to remain segregated from the world's rich to keep the global order afoot. When asked, quote, what kind of immigration would be good, Wede answered, quote, exactly the opposite of the kind we are getting. To secure economic freedom and social stability and to end civil war, large-scale migration from African and Asian countries must end, according to him. What would be the alternative? Wede suggested two, both of which came from fellow Mont Pelerin Society members. One was Gary Becker's proposal of selling the right to immigrate for a fee. The second was Richard Posner, one of the fathers of law and economics, proposal for using IQ tests to screen would-be immigrants. So what we're seeing here is not a swing from an open to a closed society, as the scandalized pundits of The Economist would have us think, but a modified openness informed by neoliberal ideas of human capital, the knowledge economy, and the prerogatives of wealth and competition. And ideas entirely, of course, at home in the peaks of Davos. So that seems like less of a stretch now that Bolsonaro sort of opened the Davos conference this year, right? And Sebastian Kurz was also a participant there. Reading the party programs of the AfD and the FPÖ, we find the rejection of economic globalization is highly selective. The EU is condemned, yes, but the language demanding increased trade and increased competitiveness is entirely mainstream. The AfD calls for trade agreements actually to be settled through the WTO. Think here of the sort of European Research Group calling for WTO now. And the lifting of barriers for exports from developing countries in the place of foreign aid transfers. Fiscal conservatism in the AfD program is taken to an absurd degree, with criminal charges demanded for policymakers who overspend. Both parties call for school choice, classic libertarian demand, and an end to the inheritance tax and burdensome regulations, even, of course, as they make new promises for social spending, right? So the thing is a kind of Frankenstein's monster, too. Free market capitalism is not rejected per se, but anchored more deeply in conservative family structures and a group identity defined against an Islamic threat from the East. Aware of the resonances with the West German social market economy of the 1950s, the AfD self-consciously uses the same slogan as the country's first economics minister and Mont Pelerin Society member Ludwig Erhard, read in their program, quote, prosperity for all, Wohlstand für alle. This new fusionism of neoliberalism and a neo-naturalism offers a language that proposes not a pan-humanist universalism of the market, but a segmented worldview based on culture and, in some cases, biology and psychology. Economic man, long looked at askance by neoliberals, Hayek called it the, quote, skeleton in the cupboard of economics, and not in a good way, has been augmented now by cultural and even racial man. The consequences of this new vision of human nature extend beyond the populist parties to alt-right separatism, identitarianism, and white nationalism. Murray Rothbard, the economist who joined the Mulpellerin Society at Hayek's invitation in the 1950s, and his protege Hans Hermann Hoppe, trained in Frankfurt by Habermas, of all people, have fused, quote, and by the way, if you ever say anything bad about Hoppe to an Austrian, they'll say, well, he's not actually an Austrian economist, he's actually a Frankfurt School theorist, and that's where all the bad stuff comes from. I have this pulled on me all the time. Hoppe, H-O-P-P-E. They fused what they call race realism with libertarianism to create a bridge between anarcho-capitalists and race theorists. The magazine which I just mentioned, Eigentümlich Frei, is the chief organ of this line of thought in Germany since its founding in 1999, deliberately attempting to create bonds between the new right and the libertarian, paleo-libertarian community. Echoes of hybrid forms of market radicalism and anti-immigration racism and culturalism can be heard, in other words, from Brexit to Charlottesville to Berlin. Of course, not all neoliberals have made the turn towards exclusionary concepts of culture and race. Some so-called left libertarians, or as they awkwardly call themselves sometimes, liberalitarians, gather around the William Niskanen Center, itself named after a Reagan, Paul, and Mulpellerin Society member, and they form here in Germany around something called NOS, fighting as they see it for the soul of neoliberalism. So the left-wing libertarians who left the Hayek Society when it became dominated by these sort of curious psychologists and IFD sympathizers created their own organization called NOS. It was founded in 2015 against the very infiltration of people like Veda and their sympathy to people like Sarrazin. These neoliberals are mobilizing against what they see as the hostile takeover of the cosmopolitan legacy of Hayek and Mises by these intolerant xenophobes. Yet, I would argue, the vehemence of their protests can sometimes obscure the fact that the supposed populist barbarians at the gates, which is often how they describe them, were actually nurtured within their very own fortress. A striking example here is Václav Klaus, who I've written about a bit recently, and is almost like he's almost like he can't be real. He's such a caricature of everything bad about politics right now. He was the darling of the neoliberal movement in the 1990s for his role as finance minister, prime minister, and president in post-communist Czech Republic. Firm advocate of shock therapy and the transition, member of the Mulpellerin Society, frequent speaker at their meetings, claimed Hayek as his personal sage. In 2013, he was a senior scholar at the Cato Institute, the stronghold of so-called left libertarianism, which is complete with its own F.A. Hayek auditorium. By the way, Murray retired last year, Charles Murray, who's much maybe more famous in the United States than here, and he became the F.A. Hayek emeritus professor of, I think even like cultural studies or something insane like that. Yet witness Václav Klaus's progress. He began the 90s by combining this call for a Schmittian rule for the strong state in a moment of transition with a kind of a Hayekian profession of the unknowability of the market. But by the later decade, he had moved into an ever more vociferous targeting of the environmental policies of the European Union. Environmental policy became a big reason for neoliberals to turn against the EU. By the early 2000s, he was a full-blown climate denier, penning a book in 2008 called, quote, Blue Planet in Green Shackles. In the 2010s, Klaus discovered the populist movement as a force for good, calling for an end to the European Union, a return to the nation state, and the closing of borders to migrants from beyond Europe. Did this lurch rightward lead to a break with the organized neoliberal movement? No. While the Mulpellerin Society strikes a pose by hosting a conference on the, quote, populist threat to the good society, Klaus argued at that very same conference that, quote, mass migration into Europe threatens to destroy European society and to create a new Europe which would be very different from the past as well as from the Mulpellerin Society way of thinking, end quote. Along with the far-right parties Klaus works with in the European Parliament, he embraces free trade and free movement of capital while drawing the line at certain kinds of people. So he was a surprise guest at the Brexit Party's big gathering the week before the European Parliament elections last month. Ideologues like Václav Klaus, in other words, are better described as xenophobic libertarians than populists, a term that I find increasingly unhelpful. They are less neoliberalism's enemies, come in from the countryside with pitchforks, than neoliberalism's children, born within decades of conversations about what fixes capitalism needs to survive. This new fix found in race, culture, and nation is only the most recent strain. A neoliberalism not based on the idea that we are all the same, but that we are in a fundamental and a perhaps permanent way different. We have not entered, in other words, a political era with a fundamentally new geometry. Exaggerating the rupture means missing a basic continuity. But confronting the new threat, I would argue, requires still better understanding the old one. Thanks. Here. Questions or comments? I just field them myself. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. I'm somewhat one-third through your book, and I'm always hesitant to ask questions for being afraid of having missed something which will come up later in the book. But what I really admire about the book so far is how nuanced and differentiated it is about this historical development of neoliberalism, which I think many other works do not deliver. And then I wonder at the same time, when you move towards the present, when you go more into the details also of how you now have split in the neoliberal camp between those who kind of more continue along the traditional line and those who now fall into the xenophobic camp.
Yeah.
How meaningful is the concept of neoliberalism still when you have that rift? Is it still useful to describe those who you described in the last part of the talk, like Václav Klaus? Is it still powerful to captivate that, or is it not, especially in the light of that very differentiated treatment of historical development, just one side of the coin, so to speak, which is not claiming to carry the torch, but would it not be better to grasp that under a different heading and to differentiate between these two camps of theory?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think that it's helpful to think about the kind of three ways that the term neoliberalism is bandied about and also used by scholars, right? Like, on the one hand, it's the kind of Wendy Brown, Dardot, and Laval model of like, it's a or the Foucault model, really, right? Which is like, it's a rationality that kind of swallowed the world and forces us all to think of ourselves as kind of bundles of human capital upon which we constantly speculate and attempt to like increase the value of. So that is something that there is no kind of there, right? I mean, people think about where did that happen? We don't know. It's this kind of organic zeitgeist. The second way is the kind of periodization story, right? Like, we entered the neoliberal era sometime in the 1970s, the kind of David Harvey position, something about financialization, outsourcing, deregulation. So then it's just another way of describing global capitalism since sometime in the 70s, or maybe into the 80s. The third way is, I think, the way that I approach it, which myself, I'm working with already an existing historiography, really started in Berlin, in fact, with Dieter Pleva, who works at the WZB and is a political scientist, but he started this project with Bernard Belton already in 1999. They were writing about the Mulparent Society in Chile, in particular. So this is a way of saying, okay, we're not describing the whole world, or an epoch, or even, a way that a variety of capitalism in this country or that country. Rather, we're approaching it kind of like intellectual historians, and we're saying, like, the same way Marxism splintered into different schools of interpretation, in the same way liberalism itself has this kind and that kind, Humean, whatever, Smithian. We're treating neoliberalism as something that is an ongoing conversation between actually a relatively small group of people over the decades, within which there's a great deal of internal diversity, right? So the book that you're talking about that I wrote was actually focusing on a relatively unresearched strain of the neoliberal thought collective that we're mostly thinking about world order problems, right? How do you protect world trade? How do you protect world capital movements? If you were in Chicago or following the Milton Friedman story, Gary Becker and Stiegler, they wouldn't be thinking about kind of global institutions or global organizations. They were talking about problems of microeconomics and things like that. So already the idea that there's a diversity of neoliberal thought is not itself a product sort of the crisis or the current moment, right? That's a fact that has existed from the 1930s onward. The approach taken in France is different than the ordoliberalism within the Freiburg School of Law and Economics and so on. So the idea of diversity is itself not new. Now, the people I'm describing here, the way that I can defend it methodologically, sort of, is that they are all part of that really small, weird group of people who's been talking to each other for over the decades, right? So no one I introduced in this talk, almost no one I mentioned in this talk, except for maybe Zaratzin, is not a member of the Mulpellerin Society. So that doesn't mean that they are a shadowy cabal of people organizing the world. I don't believe that. But it does mean that there is an intellectual coherence to their evolution in a way that you can say, people who agreed in 1990 didn't agree anymore in 2010. And what they disagreed about was often questions of culture, race, psychology, in some cases biology, right? So I wouldn't want to be put in a situation where I'd have to say, which one is the real neoliberal now, right? I mean, like, would it be the kind of Austrian economists around George Mason University who are anti-racist and who do tend to be more pro-migration, or would it be the Václav Klaus's who are, climate deniers and anti-migration? I think they are varieties of neoliberalism. They emerge straight out of like the family tree of neoliberal thought, and there might be a challenge of sort of labeling them in a way that's like memorable and descriptive, but I don't think there's really anything to be gained by sort of pronouncing one the kind of definitive one and the other the kind of, the deviant one or the heterodox one. Yeah, please.
Neoliberalism often serves as some kind of boogeyman on the left.
Sure.
And often has the smell of a conspiracy, although, like you just said, Plebe and Belton and also your colleague Dimirovsky wrote that for years now.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in your opinion. Is there any awareness amongst your colleagues that it's not really some kind of dark conspiracy that the left worked out, but it's a real thing happening and it's happening for decades now? Is there any awareness? Is it a thing now?
I think it is more and more, right? I mean, 4 years ago, let's say, this would be the constant conversation with, let's say, someone who wasn't already a sympathizer or kind of on the left, right? It would be like, they would say, pshaw, this is not even a real category. It's just a phantom created by its opponents. There are no actual adherents to neoliberalism. I mean, a couple of things have helped to change that position. One is something like the Adam Smith Institute, which is straight in this family of neoliberal think tanks, quote unquote, came out as neoliberals. So they're like, hey, you know what, damn it, we are neoliberals. Like, you might want to call us that. Well, we do claim that. We do believe in Hayek and Mises. We do believe in the Mulpellerin Society. This is our thing. We're like, thank you. Thank you. I don't have to have that argument constantly anymore. Second, I mean, this famous report from the IMF Research Division, Neoliberalism Oversold, ? Which was specifically not so much about the intellectual story, but about the package of reforms that has been associated with people like Friedman, Hayek, and Thatcher and Reagan. So they are happy to use the word at the IMF, which is notable. I feel like the kind of nominalist question, like is it a word or not a word thing, thankfully is starting to ebb. And I think it's only because of the rigorous work of scholars who are, constantly kind of showing their work and saying, it doesn't require us to find them calling themselves neoliberals every day to use that as a useful way to describe what we've otherwise described as, a very coherent body of thought. So I find I don't have to have the nominalist debate as much anymore, especially when my book was reviewed in Foreign Affairs, like Council of Foreign Relations, like in-house journal, pretty normie publication. People like Deirdre McCloskey, the historian of economic thought, reviewed it for some other normie publication. And so people there are the outliers who still think that that's the the kind of silver bullet to discredit any of this critique is to say like, aha, there is no such thing. But people are getting bored of that argument, I think, in the face of the overwhelming evidence of the existence of an intellectual tradition, which can't really be denied. You can disagree with it, but you can't really pretend that there weren't these conversations over the decades. The trick then, of course, is to write about it in a way that doesn't imply a kind of puppet master status or quality of this group. And I have like many moments in my book where I'm kind of distancing myself from that possible interpretation, where I'm just like, I'm not saying they did this. I'm not saying they did everything. I'm using them actually more as like a narrative device in some ways, as a way to like retell the 20th century and to kind of unsettle what we have as sort of common storylines about the 20th century, that it was like World War I, World War II, Cold War, end of Cold War. Well, that's not how neoliberals saw the 20th century, right? They saw the problem of mass democracy, the Great Depression, and then the kind of global South revolt in the 70s. The Cold War kind of doesn't exist. The wars, First World War, yes, but Second World War doesn't play a big role. Like if you see things from that political economic perspective, which they do, then you get a different kind of map of the 20th century. And that's what I'm kind of in it for, is unsettling kind of received ideas of the recent past. Yeah.
Isn't neoliberalism the idea of a spontaneous order of the market? I think that is what Friedrich von Hayek called catalaxy, the spontaneous order of the market.
Yes.
Where do you see that in the policy of Donald Trump? Because we're talking about protectionism. When we talk about the policy of Donald Trump, where do you see this catalaxy, or do you see it at all?
Well, I mean, I would say two things. One, I try to avoid at all costs explaining Donald Trump. I mean, I can do my best, but it would be a totally different talk. All right, well, we'll meet later. Okay. I mean, especially on trade, like, I'll give you like the tiny version on understanding Trump's trade policy, right? I think it's the artifact of a struggle between at least three separate positions within his cabinet, right? You have like the Peter Navarro position, which wants to decouple from China and declare them a bad actor, not economic partner. You have the Robert Lighthizer argument, the US trade representative, who wants to treat China like Japan was treated in the 80s, like push them around a bit, pull out some executive orders and some tariffs, and then get to better access to their market and have them voluntarily do less of the things that America doesn't like. Then you have the kind of mainliners in his economic policy cabinet, like Laffer, Larry Kudlow, Steve Mnuchin, who are just like, what is going on? I mean, they're just like tearing their hair out, right? Because like, none of this, please, God, like the status quo ante was fine. Like, let's get back to WTO, let's reboot the TPP, like let's go back to the 90s when it comes to trade, right? And they, other than, you know, figuring out new ways to punish China and that challenge. But what does Trump believe about trade? That is another layer on top of that altogether, right? Because then he says things which then his own, I mean, even literally like Peter Navarro, like his big trade hawk, will be like, oh, whoa, okay, all right. And then spins it for the comment on MSNBC later, right? So I think that, I mean, one thing that I would say that I think does connect to my argument is that the principle of like competitiveness, national competitiveness, maximization of national human capital, and seeing the nation as like a bundle of economic capacities that can be like leveraged and invested in and expanded on is indeed as much part of the Trump story as it was the Obama and Clinton story. The catalaxy point, so I kind of cover this in the last chapter of the book, because my argument with that is basically, I agree that Hayek believes in this sort of sublime quality of the market. It's sort of ineffable. You can't even say the economy, because if you say the economy, then you might think that you can plan the economy. So you have to say catalaxy. And catalaxy is like neurons firing. It's like galaxies forming, right? I mean, literally, it's iron filings moving on a piece of paper. So I believe that he believes that. But the other side of his body of writings is blueprints for legal design. I mean, the Constitution of Liberty is not just a kind of, you know, meditation on the catalaxy. It's also like a black and white set of proposals about term limits, number of people who can be elected to a new sort of quasi House of Lords, the ways that we can insulate the Cadillacy from interruption by populations that get the wild idea in their heads that they can change the law, right? I mean, that's why he draws the line between law and legislation, which he gets from Carl Schmitt, meaning legislation is something that democracies make and they pretend it's real, whereas law is something that judges know and enforce, and it is real. And we need that judge-made law to prevent the Cadillacy from being disrupted by democratic populations. So the whole book is, in a way, is people inspired by that tradition who are saying, all right, so what's the minimum/maximum level of legal intervention that is necessary to preserve the sublime order of the world economy, whether it's bilateral investment treaties, a reform of the GATT into the WTO, and the whole institutional architecture then becomes the encasement for the sublime object of the economy. Yeah.
I have a question personal to you.
Yeah.
That I would like to have a question in this room actually, but since of time reasons, there's no room. Knowing the bad guys, what do you personally do against it? Because you have two sides. You have you,
yeah,
and you have the us. The us, it's right now. It's political parties and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And what do you do if you are not the us, if you are the you? If you're by yourself at home and you're consumer.
Yeah.
What do you do?
I mean, my guess role in this is just like, I guess what you would call like political enlightenment. I mean, if I wanted to be grandiose about it, I would call it that. Otherwise known as research and like Googling the shit out of like really weird figures like Hans Hermann Hoppe, and then writing papers about them and distributing them through the internet. That's basically what I do. That's what I do. And I mean, it's not gonna like...
That's the informal way of doing something.
Yeah, I guess so. It's also a formal way of doing something. I mean, I'm like, that's just a total, I mean, you know, going to the streets and punching Nazis, I'm 100% endorse. Like, I think that is the necessary supplement to Googling right-wing freaks. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, yeah. So I try not to keep it in the academy. That's why I really like conversations like this. I don't like talking to just like the colloquium or like the seminar room, because for me, that's like a stale exercise in professionalization with actually no promise at the end, because there is no job market for historians. It doesn't make sense to pretend that there is one over and over. It makes much more sense to be in this situations where it's just like, oh my God, something wild is happening in the world. Like, what can we grasp at to help make sense of it more? So yeah, but I appreciate the question. Yeah.
What would you say is the state of neoliberalism right now? So the division, is it really in decline of this division, or because of this division, or is it still healthy? What would you say? What do you feel?
I think, yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think if you think about it like the way that a cell divides, it doesn't become weaker when it divides, right? I mean, it actually, that's the process that produces a more robust organism. I mean, I think that what's happening right now is, and let me just say, because to maybe head off a question that will almost certainly come, which will be like, but the voters for Brexit Party, AfD, FPU, aren't necessarily voting because they believe in these things. I agree and I accept that, and that's why we have political scientists who work with, you know, exit polls and do opinion data and stuff. And I completely agree that there's a mismatch between what people think that they're signing up for with these quote-unquote right-wing populist parties, and then the kind of political entrepreneurship that's happening at the level of someone like a Klaus or a Farage, who's been just doing shady deals like literally for decades now, right? Like connecting to whatever seems like the train that's moving the fastest towards like a paycheck for him and power. So I think if you look at the side of like the political entrepreneurs and the language that they're producing, which is what I did today, then splitting makes, you know, it makes it harder to get out of the kind of vice grip of the idea that the whole, you know, horizon of human aspiration is just competition through the market, for example, right? Because if you have one group that's saying the nation is the platform and the race is the platform, and then you have another group that's saying, no, we need to scale up and do this through free trade agreements. But both still have the same premise, which is just like inequality is unavoidable, competition is the way of life, and you know there is no end to capitalism ever imaginable, then I think having two flavors of that is worse than having one flavor. right? I mean, I have to say, like, I don't think it makes the fight any easier, because then you get caught in all of these misidentifications where, like, young, maybe misguided people who are drawn to alt-right or right libertarian things talk about the globalists as if this is a political tradition that is somehow alien from their own. I really don't think it is. Like, I don't think that the tradition of people who like imagine something like the WTO is actually fundamentally different from the people who think that you should, peel off part of the American South and create like a cryptocurrency based like, Wonderland or whatever. They're actually part of the same, it's the same family tree. Like, you guys realize that, right? Like, I do think it's helpful to like point out, and this is like back to the prior question. I mean, I really do think it's necessary to find avenues to reach, especially young people who are at a state of political disorientation in the present. And in the United States, this is a role that things like, obviously, like social media and podcasts play. But it's become pretty obvious that something like YouTube is much more important than anything audio-based.
Question on that.
Yes, please.
Because, the term globalist, do you really think that the term globalist as used by Donald Trump or Steve Bannon is really the globalist you refer to? Do you think that? No, because I mean the term really has two genealogies, right? I mean, if you pick up a political science journal from the 1940s, then you'll see people talking about globalists and globalism. And what they mean is basically, should the United States be worried about creating a kind of a post-war world order, or should it be more regionally interested or even more kind of isolationist, right? Then there's the kind of fringy genealogy of the category, which is like mostly openly anti-Semitic, and of course premised on this idea of finance is somehow disembedded from the globe and exists in this kind of stratosphere that just inhales value from populations and does something somewhere, I don't know, shady, like mountains in Zurich or outside of Zurich or wherever, the gnomes of Zurich kind of trope. So no, I think those are two very different categories. The way that, of course, I don't associate myself to the way that it's used in the far right. But I think there is a kind of a shared response to the kind of long 1990s consensus, right? The idea that capitalism and everyone's best outcomes are best served through large multilateral organizations that take some things out of national hands and seed them upwards to supranational institutions like the WTO, like the EU, like NAFTA. I think there is indeed a backlash against that. My whole point is that that is not the only way to protect capitalism, nor was it ever the only way to protect capitalism. And there's ways of doing capitalism even along lines of neoliberal sort of orthodox concepts of it without the stratum of supranational institutions. And I think that too often the two are taken as the same thing. So if you're criticizing a supranational economic institution, then you must be criticizing neoliberalism, because that is the essence of neoliberalism. But I would disagree. I would say that would be one. That was one sort of historically time-bound manifestation of it. And we are probably moving into another one. But I don't want to speak too soon. The idea of like a rebooted WTO, like minus China, is still, to me, not an impossibility. Yeah, behind there?
Some people would argue that like center-left parties in the 1990s were kind of neoliberalized.
Yeah.
People like Blair and Schröder and perhaps Clinton. But with your description of a, say, like neoliberal ideological family, then the Social Democrats not
fit very well. That's
family.
right.
So how would you describe what happened to these parties? How can we grasp that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I think that the uptake of, let's say, market analogies for politics, so someone like Al Gore talking about how the citizen is, first of all, a customer of the state, right? And the introduction of things like audit culture into public services and constantly measuring things in terms of how much, what their cost-benefit analysis is and so on. I hesitate a bit to use the term neoliberalism to describe that. I think that kind of managerialism is more what I would describe that as. And honestly, I think you can probably, and people have found genealogies of that in Soviet communism that are in some ways as substantial as the ones from within the kind of actuarial culture of liberal capitalism. I think the idea of, relating to a population in terms of like units that are having to have certain outputs that need a certain kind of oversight against which, you know, their own effectiveness is measured. I don't see that per se as like a neoliberal problematic. I mean, I think this is where the work of someone like Johanna Bachmann is quite helpful. So she and Tobias Ruprecht, who's actually here in Berlin but teaches at Exeter, he talks about how, and Johanna Bachmann talks about how when communist parties in government wanted to understand capitalism, they read Marx. But when they wanted to figure out how to plan communism, they read marginalists like Walras and Jevons and Marshall, because that's where they could get an idea of how to kind of treat, you know, units of productivity, blah, 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 how to organize it. So I think all that's to say is I think that part of what I'm invested in also is not reducing the whole history of political economy down to like varieties of neoliberalism. I think that there's kind of an important, obviously, tradition of social democracy and socialism that include aspects of what have come to be known as neoliberalism in ways that can be helpfully disentangled. So you know, it is certainly true that when you read, as I've done recently, speeches by someone like Bill Clinton from the 1990s, it's just like, oh my God. I mean, all he does is talk about like unleashing entrepreneurial energy and like the market is going to solve. I mean, it's just like this, it actually does start to sound more like a kind of market fundamentalism, to be honest with you. But I guess that's, you know, it's something that I haven't quite figured out yet. What I can say is that the adoption of market language by erstwhile social democrats is precisely one of the things that freaks out by neoliberals, right? Because they're like, wait a sec. If they're talking the market language now, then maybe we need to be looking somewhere else, because we know that left-wing parties constantly adopt languages to kind of expand their ambit as a tactical way of sort of gaining more power in their way of thinking. So the very success of neoliberalism became the reason for more skepticism from some of these sort of orthodox neoliberals I'm looking at. So that's a kind of a dialectic I'm quite interested in. Yeah.
And now we're in this question is academic, but I'm asking anyway. It's sort of a two-part question. The first part's open-ended, the second's more concrete. I was curious, when you're looking at the archive, of how this sort of fusion of a market logic with like cybernetics and natural evolutionary logics happens, especially because it seems that in some previous thinkers, culture is a way not to talk about race. I'm just curious if there are like mediating concepts that do that work effectively. Like you mentioned Dawkins and the meme importance. Like, are there terms or ideas that help that take off? And then the more concrete question was just, you know, with the mapping of the genome in the 90s, there's also this moment where progressive biologists are saying, like, actually race has no genetic basis, and I remember Bill Clinton saying that. Do your characters like react to that or to that interpretation of the mapping of the genome at all, or are they just not engage it?
Right. So, I mean, the first part of the question I think is good, and I've got this question before, and it's sort of like the Etienne Balibar question, right? Like, don't we talk about culture now as a way to really talk about race? Isn't that just simply the acceptable way to effectively still describe groups as being essentially bound in certain ways that is effectively never going to change and might imply inability to integrate and so on? And I think that's partially true for sure. I mean, the huge backlash against development economics is quite interesting insofar as it was put in a totally culturalist idiom. So someone like Douglas North, for example, wins the Nobel Prize in the early 90s in economics. And he basically says, I'm not saying that all cultures can't get there, but I'm just saying it takes hundreds of years, right? And that is actually like the David Landis argument. That is kind of a pretty common global history, how the West got ahead and how it's going to stay there kind of an argument that goes around, that is pretty mainstream actually, right? That one isn't actually particularly far out. But I think that it's precisely because of it, again, like being mainstream, that there's a reaction against it, which is like, this is too wishy-washy. And the very idea that culture is at least potentially, even over hundreds of years, adaptable or malleable or open to change, leads us, the race realists, to want to turn to a harder language, right? So their adoption or their return to racial science and this fixation on IQ happens very much in response to a kind of a mainstreaming of the idea of the cultural foundations of it's right. So it's again like a move further to the right of something which on the face of it is already kind of a rightward shift in the discourse. And then the question you're asking about the end of the Genome Project and that, I mean, that's an interesting one, right? Because the first response to the Genome Project is, aha, we've proven it, race has no genetic basis. But flash forward 10, 15 years from that, actually the discourse changes, right? And there, interestingly enough, this is people like Alondra Nelson have written about this. It's often kind of physicians or geneticists of color, it's people from the Black community and things like that, who are saying, no, you can actually, let's be probabilistic about this. You can find certain like, what are they called? Alleles that are associated with certain populations. We're not calling them races, they're populations, but if we are attentive to those, then we can help underserved communities, get ahead of diseases more quickly, be preventative. So this is what, Rogers Brubaker has this kind of devastating take on it, which is like, hey, social sciences and humanities, you guys owned race for like 50 years, from like the UNESCO statement on race to the 2010. It was all social construction, and basically everyone went along with that. But the human genome, like genetics now, is galloping at such a rate that science has kind of won the right of the sovereignty of interpretation again, right? And I have to admit that I think the social sciences and the humanities haven't caught up to that shift in the public discussion too. We still don't know how to respond to it, except just to say, wave our hands and say, no, it's actually just social construction. And this, of course, has been a great boon to the race realists, because that's all they do. That's their primary rhetorical move, is to say, you foolish leftists, cultural Marxists, ... deny what is even accepted by the most mainstream Yale, Columbia, choose your Ivy, psychologist or biologist. So I think that yeah, that's the kind of double move that happened, right? Like culture gets mainstreamed in the 90s, they go for race. Now race is kind of getting mainstreamed in some ways, and they're feeling like it's their moment, right? So, and I wouldn't make such a big deal. Because I think the Balabar point is a correct one in the vernacular way that culture and race circulate, and even in the mainstream political way. But it's just like that division between hard biological race and kind of fuzzy culture is so central to this divide within the intellectual tradition I'm looking at that I think it makes sense that I'm emphasizing it so much and seeing it as, materially distinct. Yeah.
I have a question you probably answered in your book that I'll ask anyway. So you spoke about a turn towards reason and morals in the 1970s. I'd like to know more about the relevance of this term, the function that is served, and also what it was in nature, because you mentioned one Christian West, which is quite a good bit of cultural luggage.
Oh yeah,
yeah, and if you could say something about both its implementation and policies, and also what role, if any, it has in the shifts towards a culturalistic approach.
Yeah, I think that I would say two things. One is that especially the analogies between humans and animals that are created in sociobiology as a new discipline are significant, not so much in the short term, but in the long term. So I think that idea, I think, is becoming more and more a kind of a metaphorical way and a literal way to talk about the market. So if you think of populations as like constantly seeking to reproduce their own genetic material and choosing out, winners according to robustness and fitness for competition and stuff, I think that language is actually kind of a hallmark of this newer strain of neoliberalism, like an openness into think about populations in combat with each other that actually moves away from the Hayekian idea of Cadillacs. I think there actually is a lot of like what Hayek would call scientism in that, to say that you can just look at human populations and know enough about them to know the way that they behave. So I think that created an opening for a kind of a return of a certain social Darwinist logic that I think you do see circulate in sort of right-wing populist rhetoric. And I would also say that in terms of the neoliberals I'm looking at, and the kind of actually more the broader historical context, this is something I haven't really written about or thought about much, but you know, you get decolonization is kind of complete by the end of the 1970s. In other words, Britain no longer has colonies abroad. France no longer has colonies abroad. Portugal loses its last colonies in Africa at the end of the 1970s after the Carnation Revolution. So the idea of a kind of a circulation of people from the metropole to the colony, which was, such as it was, actually kind of a normal thing in the whole era of empire, right up until the 1970s, especially for Europeans. People from places like Kenya, Pakistan, Bangladesh had the right to move and live and work in Great Britain, right, even after empire was over. But with the end of that, you know, we do get a kind of a congealing of a certain vision of the world as actually arriving at like the Wilsonian principle of self-determination, where now we do have one culture, one territory, one language, right? In a weird way, empire had kind of undercut that vision because you had more circulation. So now the idea of people from another culture crossing into your country is like a clear breach of sovereignty or something, in a way that actually in the imperial era, there was a lot of freedom of movement and circulation of labor from the colonies to the metropole and vice versa. So I think there's a naturalizing of the nation as like a moral and a cultural container, which helps that kind of idea of the Christian West that you describe. It helps to make that like a legal reality, whereas empire, ironically, actually always undercut in practice the idea that the West existed in sublime isolation from the rest of the world. We know that they didn't because they were literally administering other parts of the world. Once they were no longer doing that, then they could claim to actually be existing, you know, separately from it. So I think that also gave a spur to the kind of social Darwinist imagination that I'm trying to get at the heart of here. Yeah, Joachim.
Hey. So I was wondering, so it seems to me that you're making two arguments.
Yeah.
One is good academic scholarly argument about neoliberalism being intellectual tradition, like Marxism, history and some family tree, and that's all fine, and details are finely trained.
Yeah.
So I like that argument. But you also seem to make a political argument. So the answer said that understanding the enemy better, not just romanticizing the rupture of communities, will help us fight the enemy in that way.
Yeah.
So the way the historical argument should inform a political argument, should enable us to do something political. But I don't quite get it. So how does understanding this actually help us do something politically? And I found it, the answer, in a way, I found it sort of curious, to be honest, that you felt that sort of places like this are sort of more sort of interesting, more meaningful for you than sort of historical colloquia, historical and there. So the threshold is low if you think about it. So historical academic conference to be something sort of more meaningful than that.
Yeah, almost everything is more meaningful than that, exactly. Like a good game of croquet is more meaningful.
It is a very academic talk that you're giving. So in a way, is the answer in a way expanding like the GSA to sort of the broad public.
Okay.
And I'm not quite convinced by that.
Okay. Well, I hope to convince you over time. So I can return to one example that I mentioned in passing in the talk. Peter Boehringer, right, sitting in the Bundestag for the AfD, precious metals consultant, end of the world believer, survivalist, stone cold against the idea of fiat money, believes that it is what he calls monetary socialism. And so if we continue to print money at the ECB, we will collapse the world economy, which is why in his memorable image he includes on his blog of Karl Marx's head over Frankfurt, because it's actually, socialism comes from the ECB. The migrants are only a symptom of the central illness, which is this incorrect understanding of how the world monetary system works. The AfD built their credibility in some ways in their early years by being the kind of only open public critics in some ways of the idea of the euro, right? The idea that there should be a common currency. They called for a return to the Deutschmark. The more far out guys like Boehringer were saying not even the Deutschmark, we need to go back to gold. Their politics, in other words, are like they're about a very peculiar and very specific kind of economic imagination. And it's one that I think has purchase in certain parts of the German population for reasons that are not immediately obvious. So for example, the number of small German savers who move their money into gold in the and after 2008 because of zero interest rates and the insecurity of the euro reflects a kind of a waning trust in monetary institutions, as well as, of course, trying to follow the rising value of gold. And someone like Boehringer sees that very clearly, and in the case of his blog was both selling gold to people and stoking fears of apocalypticism, and then somehow managed to fold that into a now position sitting in the Bundestag for the AfD. So there's actually much more, I think, to the popularity of that party than meets the eye, than what we have is normally on front forward on the posters, of the idea that it's, just outright xenophobia, Islamophobia, pronatalism, pronativism. I think that there's ways of thinking about the challenge that it presents to the political economy that as leftists, we can then try to construct an alternative that doesn't attack the symptom, but attacks more the source of what they see as being the problem. So I'll give you an example that the present discussion after especially the victory of the Danish Social Democrats, that the way to fight neoliberalism is to close borders and be harder on migration, because it's actually a neoliberal plot to open borders, and it's what finance capital wants to kind of bring in cheap workers and do wage dumping and social dumping. I think that if you see that there's a strain of neoliberalism that also is calling for strong borders and is also seeing the population in these kind of, in terms of their human capital terms and calculating in those ways, then it would give us pause, I think, to embrace that kind of rhetoric ourselves as their opponents. So I think actually figuring out who our opponents actually are, figuring out that they are both the people who want to, bring down wages through manipulation of labor markets, and the ones who are talking about populations in terms of IQ and capacity for rational economic behavior. Yeah, I mean, it makes it harder to figure out a counter strategy, but I don't think that you can get there just through kind of like sloganeering about neoliberalism in the broad sense, right? So I think that if you only treat neoliberalism as an undifferentiated mass, as just the spirit of capitalism in 2019 or 2015, and we don't have it anymore, then I think you're kind of rudderless. Like I think you don't know how to frame a counter politics, actually. I mean, I wouldn't spend all my time doing this if I didn't believe that. So, I mean, maybe part of it is that you are an academic yourself, and so like going out of the academy and hearing an academic is like, oh, why did I even leave the academy? but not everyone has conversations like that all the time, right? So it can be kind of enjoyable to like plunge into the longer term history of something, kind of deal with primary sources and do the historian stuff. Yes, please.
That last comment, that's somewhat ironic, because that means the AfD voters who moved their money to gold wouldn't actually benefit from any potential windfall if the euro were to be split up. The banking union is a banking union.
Wait, say it again. They wouldn't benefit from any windfall?
So if the euro were to be split up, because the banking union isn't really a banking union unless you have stormtroopers at the borders, the money will flow into the banks in Germany. If Germany were to go back to, say, the Deutsche Bank, at least initially, the savers will benefit from a windfall. But those particular AfD voters who have had or moreover have gold wouldn't benefit from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what they...
Ironic.
Yeah, it is ironic, but I think, you can't overstate the binaries and the apocalyptic tones within which they are forming their political visions of the future. So, I mean, at some point I've realized in the course of studying this stuff that there's literally no difference between political rhetoric and speculative fiction in the stuff I'm reading. I can't tell which I'm reading, right? Because if I read Boehringer on his blog in 2014 saying like, you know, like the citadels are afire with fiat money, like soon they shall crumble or something. And like, we have only 10 years to prepare or something. And then I open some like libertarian novel, like sci-fi novel from the 70s. It's like, the citadels are afire. I mean, it's the same language, right? So in other words, what you're talking about, which is quite a rational sort of forecast, is not the language of politics that they're employing, right? I mean, it's very much an either or. It's not like, well, given that we may return to a national currency, could we imagine that gold would experience a small, it's not like that. It's like we are facing, you know, it's a very Achilleastic kind of end of days type language. Like the end of fiat money will be the end of civilization as we know it. And we need to prepare for that through storing value in ways that we know through 5,000 years of Western civilization will always hold its value, and then take care of our own, right? That's, if you know what I mean, right? I'm just using that as a kind of...
Or they imagine the value of gold will suddenly shoot up because the Deutsche Mark.
Yeah, right.
That's irrational.
Yeah, I mean, you need to spend some time with these people to realize how insane it is. So there is a real cycle between, and this is something I haven't been explicit about yet, but between investment advice, the world of investment advice, and the world of so-called right-wing populism, right? And I'm not only saying that because Thilo Sarrazin published his most recent book on Finanzbuchverlag, which publishes entirely investment advice manuals, Peons to Hayek and Mises, and then his new book on the domestic enemy that is Islam. So there's a way that the construction of hype, often in online circles, is the model now for right-wing populist politics, right? I mean, that's sort of Richard Seymour's way of understanding the Brexit Party, for example, right? I mean, it doesn't exist as a party. It's purely an online platform. So it's produced through like a cycle of fear-mongering, gathers momentum in a certain way, and then has a direct effect on the political process. Peter Navarro, actually, in the case of Trump, is another wonderful example of this, even though he seems like really left field of the whole neoliberal thing. So in the early 2000s, he was writing books called things like, If It's Raining in Brazil, Buy Starbucks, which were just like, hey, you want to make a killing in the stock market? Like what you want to do is short this and do that and do that. And now he just moved that rhetoric to xenophobia, right? Which is just like, hey, America's going to get killed if we don't do these things now. What we want to do is do tariff. So this way of sort of thinking of the nation as a platform upon which, you know, politics is being played out for the short-term, medium-term maximization of value through the production of constantly self-realizing apocalyptic prophecies, right, is kind of like such a strange mix of kind of the business world and the kind of mysticism of neoliberal thought that, you know, I haven't quite pinned it down yet, but it's in the works. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I often ask myself, how did these ideas become so popular? I thought, well, maybe do the neoliberals have like did they come up with an innovative way of spreading their ideas? Mm-hmm. So you talk a lot about think tanks and so on. Yeah. Or is there really something to their way of spreading knowledge, or is it just friends and high places and class?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think that, so other people have focused their research specifically on how knowledge is produced in things like think tanks and then kind of turned into policy. One example is the Heritage Foundation, right? When it was founded, the idea was you need to have something they call the briefcase test, which is that anything that's coming in front of Congress needs to have a background information that can fit inside a briefcase. So you can go to any one member of Congress and open it up and explain to them or give it to them. Then they turned it into just the piece of paper test. So it needed to be 8.5 by 10 A4 paper, front and back, called a backgrounder. And this is everything you need to know. And so ahead of every vote, everyone in Congress gets that. And so if you're like most lawmakers, which is like you're not really paying attention to day-to-day bills appearing, and you get this thing, you're like, oh, okay. I mean, it literally seeds like a kind of a streamlined version of what policymaking could look like. There's other sort of, and there's stories for every one of the big policy innovations. So actually standing in the back here is someone who's written a history about how the Bretton Woods system ended. So the creation of sort of groups of economists and bankers talking about the need to move to flexible exchange rates, meeting over the years, putting pressure on policymakers. Yeah, there's a whole story about mobilizing knowledge into policy there that, you know, it's hard to sort of follow alongside this kind of story I'm following. But actually there is a distinction there that's actually really relevant, which is from the 40s when Hayek creates the Multipolaran Society to the 90s, there was basically one model of disseminating neoliberal ideas according to the orthodoxy, right, which was the think tank. Hayek had this argument about secondhand dealers in ideas. He said, you know, you don't actually target the intellectuals, you target the journalists, or you target the people who make public opinion. And so they did that with degrees of success, but it was always this sort of trickle-down public enlightenment kind of a thing. In the 90s, there was an actual kind of theorization within neoliberal circles about how you can use direct democracy. So the Swiss People's Party, the Austrian Freedom Party are actually writing in the early 90s about how we've always been suspicious of the masses. We always thought democracy was a problem, and therefore we needed to come up with institutions to kind of lock in certain prerogatives of capital. That was just the kind of assumption from the 30s onward. But what if now the elites believe in socialism more than the masses? What if actually the masses don't believe in socialism anymore? What if they are truer capitalists than the policymakers? Then maybe you can weaponize the masses against the elites. So something like direct democracy, the introduction of referendums and things like that is, you know, is literally theorized anyway, partially in response to things that are already happening. So this seems like a bad thing because we generally are very suspicious of like the masses in movement. But maybe there are ways now that, you know, with the way that pension funds have been privatized, with the way that people rely so much on private home ownership as a way of safeguarding their wealth from one generation to the next, intergenerational debt, that people actually see themselves reflected in the market more than they do reflected in kind of imaginary extra market space of like the people or the kind of solidarity of the working class that maybe had once existed in the 1930s when they first started theorizing this stuff. So there is a kind of a switch in the means of doing politics, which is actually why you get more of these dyed-in-the-wool, actual card-carrying Multipolaran Society guys and women. There's not very many, but there are a couple. Like actually taking part in party politics, right? Like running for the Swiss People's Party, running for the AfD. That wasn't something they were doing much of before, right? It was usually kind of sniping from the ivory tower / sort of working with the think tanks, but the idea of actually being, you know, running for office is actually kind of a bit unusual within the kind of neoliberal history. Yeah. Is there a question?
Yeah, it's kind of related to that. But this is a really fascinating history, but it seems like it's mostly in elite history, right? This battle of neoliberalism,
yeah.
Institutions, political parties, that's what.
Yeah.
But of course now people are voting for them. So what's going on there? Are people voting for them thinking that they're voting against liberal ideology and they're being duped, or what's this dynamic there?
Yeah, no, I mean that is the difficulty. I mean it's one thing to sort of do what I'm doing, which is just like, okay, I'm going to draw a line around these people and say like, what are they all talking about? But like, if I'm them talking about politics, then how does it like filter down? I mean, I can, on the one hand, defer to my political scientist colleagues as I did earlier and say like we need to draw on other sources to figure out what people think they're voting for. Are people being duped? It's honestly hard for me to see it any other way. Like when I look at the Brexit vote and I know what, you know, UKIP and Institute of Economic Affairs have been talking about as the need for a new trade treaty, let's say, between the US and the UK to replace the EU that will open up agriculture, you know, free it from protection that it had under the Common Agricultural Policy, that will dismantle the NHS and marketize that as well, that will really accelerate, you know, use the Atlantic access as an accelerated form of a kind of rejuvenated capitalism that was free from the Eurosclerosis that has so long, you know, contained them. I mean, in that case, I don't know how to interpret any other way. Like that's an especially stark case, I think. I think if you look at the AfD, it's a trickier one because I think that it's not clear that the people I'm describing, the kind of Hayek, Alice Weidel, kind of Hayek society people have the high ground in the AfD right now. Even the Beringers, right? I mean, I think the Gauland sort of faction, like Gauland doesn't really fit into the story very well. Like, and this is true in many right-wing populist parties, you get a kind of like coalition of kind of gnarly free market libertarians with cultural nationalists, and they work together, and one's forward at other times and others forward at other times. And often, thankfully, they don't actually enter power, so we don't know whose side will actually win out. So in that sense, if the AfD took power and we got like a nativist strengthened welfare state with hard borders, then I would have been wrong and they weren't duped. But if the AfD got into power on the other side went.
It seems like, Marine Le Pen is much closer to getting to power in
Yep.
France than here in Germany, and she, I think, is much more of a protectionist than her father was.
Than her father was, for sure. Yeah, the National Front is a classic case of this sort of starting out more kind of anti-Brussels, austerity-minded, anti-social spending, and then, because that doesn't sell very well to especially older voters, you shift over time. So yeah, this is why I kind of like try to hesitate at making overly broad claims for what I'm presenting here. At some level, if you want to understand what's happening in each nation, you need to just look at each nation. I think that like the interesting thing about something like Italy and with the Lega is that some of the people I'm talking about, like Rothbard, for example, in the 90s, he was very excited about the Lega because he was excited about secessionism, and he was excited about states dissolving, because it seemed like if you got these sort of big cumbersome states broken up into smaller units, then they'd compete with each other better. You'd have a higher level of cultural homogeneity. That would be good. So I can point out things like that, but the internal domestic story for any given political party, I think, is often like this story I'm telling mixed with other stories, and I guess that's maybe the difficulty of answering it, and we don't know whether the voters are duped until we know what these people are actually going to do when they come into power. Maybe I should call it there, do you think? I feel like I'm going to pass out, so I think this might be a good time to stop. Thank you.